Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the WION Sports Broadband edition with me, Digvijay Singh Deo. My guest today is an all-time legend of world sport who has now made a more than successful transition into the world of sports administration. I'm privileged to be joined by Lord Sebastian Coe, two-time Olympic champion and the president of World Athletics. Lord Coe, now, all your life, you've sort of been this completely outdoor person. So how has this lockdown been treating you?
Well, I think it's been a challenge for all of us, particularly those of us that like working in groups and in offices. But actually, interestingly, I guess the one thing that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, and I've explained this to my colleagues as well, that having been an athlete, you rather learn to work remotely for most of your career. And you learn to work remotely, and now the athletes are working remotely and using technology. Sometimes their coaches are not always at the training sessions, and often they're not always at the competitions. They could be sitting 8 time zones away, watching and observing on the technology that allows them maybe 20 minutes after a competition to be able to analyze what went well, what might not have gone so well, to talk even about what that means for the training program the following day. So in a funny sort of way, I've always been used as an athlete to working remotely. It rather reminds me of that time now.
Okay, but I must admit, Lord Coe, that you're closing in on your 64th birthday, but you must be the fittest 64-year-old, because I saw you on your Twitter feed doing that 2.6 challenge, and just that push-ups would have broken me completely, and I'm much, much younger to you.
Well, it was a very good challenge, and it was actually created by the London Marathon, because on the day of the London Marathon, like most of our big city races, a lot of money is raised for charity. And there was a real fear that if you didn't have the London Marathon, because sadly it had been postponed until later on in the year, a lot of charities would miss out. So the challenge was really to create and to raise money around what would have been the marathon and inspire lots of people to do lots of exercises. I did my own challenge, raised some money, and yes, it was a good exercise.
I am not going anywhere near that exercise.
In both ways.
Yes, of course. Let's talk a bit about sport, Lord Coe, because a few days back, World Athletics came out with the new Diamond League schedule. But what are the factors do you think, as the head of this body, that need to be ticked before sport can resume completely? There is going to be a situation where athletes all over the world are facing travel restrictions or quarantine regulations. And, it's probably not going to be fair until we have all of them on board as well. So what are the things we need to have completely ticked before we can see sport resume completely, especially your sport?
Look, I think it's really important that the guiding principle has to be about safety. The athletes have to be understanding that we're not going to do anything that's going to put them in harm's way. The very fact that we pushed the International Olympic Committee to make a decision slightly earlier than they probably were going to. It was a tough decision. Nobody was criticizing them for that. But I think our guiding principle has always been what is it that's going to make the athletes comfortable? We need to get them back into competition. Absolutely. They want that. The fans want that. But we have to be respectful. We can't put them into harm's way. And it's not just about them being in harm's way. It's the risk that they might also infect their loved ones, their families, their parents, their grandparents. And we don't want that to happen. But look, we have created, where possible, a structure. Yes, you're right to refer to Diamond League and our continental tour, but they're going to look different. We understand that. There's not going to be an overall Diamond League winner if we are able to get our competitions up in August, as we hope we are. There isn't going to be a Diamond League final in Zurich. And we will have to make sure, and this is where the meeting directors will make their own decisions about how they can get athletes into competition that's safe and secure and doesn't risk infection. And that's a challenge. Each one of those Diamond League directors will identify the format for their competition and some of these safety considerations about 2 months before the competitions.
Okay, but Lord Coe, when you talk about safety, you know, I know social distancing is the new prevailing buzzword across the world, but is social distancing, is it possible in your sport? Because anything, even though it's not a contact sport, anything ahead of the 400-meter mark, there are athletes coming in close contact with each other.
Yes, that is true. And some events are slightly easier because you can run them in lanes, and some are not. You know, 1,500 meters, which was my distance, is more complicated. But already I've had thoughts being sent to me by member federations, the Italian Federation the other day, talking about how you might have athletes setting off for those events at staggered times and staggered pace. And adding up the overall, you know, determining the first, second and third right the way through to 8 on the aggregate time. So I think everybody is wanting to get back to competition. I think everybody is going to be creative and as ingenious as they possibly can be. And I think we have to recognize that that's probably where we are at the moment. It isn't going to be possible to get stadiums full of people back as quickly as we want. And the world is at varying paces. You know, the world's at varying stages of sadly, of the pandemic. There are some countries that have been coming out of it for some time. There are those that sadly are still possibly to hit the peak. And my own country is a good example. We are still effectively locked down here, and facilities, as I know they are in India, are closed to many of our competitors.
Yes, and that's the reason I'm coming to you from my drawing room, Lord Coe, not being able to go to office because of the lockdown regulations. But you spoke about sport behind closed doors. You know, a lot of athletics, or even other sport, the sport you follow closely as well as football, these are sports which thrive on atmospherics. Do you sort of grudgingly have to make the compromise that, you know, we'll have to go on without fans, because athletics for the last 3 or 4 years had started to draw in the fans in greater numbers than it was in the previous last decade?
I think for the immediate future, we probably have to accept that if we get competition back, it's going to be viewed by, you know, it's not going to be viewed by large groups of people. The athletes need the competition. It's really important. Athletes don't wake up in the morning just to train. They wake up to train in order to compete at the highest level. And that's important. And I think that's got to be sensible. That has to be a sensible compromise. And we have to be guided, of course, by what governments are telling us and what the World Health Organization is telling us and what public health authorities are telling us. Sport will ultimately have to make some decisions for itself as well. There may be a moment when sport decides, actually, we think we are ready and we think we can stage these events, even if it's not always with the approval of those authorities. That's where sport, you know, we will be respectful, but sport ultimately has to make the decisions that they think is in the best interests of not just itself, but its athletes.
Of course, and they're not bound to be popular, but the show has to go on. But Lord Coe, as the guardian, in a sense, of the sport, as someone, you know, who sort of has to look at all the other aspects and not just the athletes, you got to look at the referees, you got to look at the volunteers, you got to look at everything else. How important is it to keep engaging with the fan? The reason I ask that, Lord Coe, is because in some sports there is this concept of having e-gaming or virtual racing. It's not possible perhaps in athletics, but what we are seeing is this a lovely thing I saw a couple of weeks back is this garden challenge. We're going to have a new one with the women also attempting it. In the absence of perhaps fans not in stadiums, this is the best way to sort of keep them engaged, keep them interested in your sport?
I don't think there's been a sport that has attempted to keep our fans more engaged than athletics. I'm very proud of everything that's being done at headquarters. I'm proud of the ideas the athletes have come up with. I'm proud with what our federations are doing to help us in this space. There's not a sport that has responded as well as athletics, and I'm very proud that it's athletics that has done that. And we need to make sure that we utilize every bit of technology that allows us to stay more connected. I do this regularly. I mean, I'm doing this at this very moment with you. But, you know, this weekend I will be joining the African the African Council meetings. During the course of the week, I was joined the European Council meetings, the Oceania Council meetings. I've spoken to the athletes, I've spoken to our executive board, I've spoken to my council colleagues, I've spoken to our working groups. This morning I addressed all 100 members of our World Athletics headquarters. So there is a lot that we can do with technology, and I guess smart organizations are learning and absorbing their learnings as they go along. We want to come out of the sport stronger, fitter, more robust, and more able to future-proof ourselves, but at the same time do exactly what you talked about, which is engaging our fans to keep closer to them. You know, the real challenge we have is to make sure that our fans, you know, are up close and center when it comes to their athletes, their personal stories, their competitions. It's all part of the same landscape.
Of course, and what I can see from that is robust leadership from World Athletics. But just talking about leadership, because you did mention the Olympics a bit at the back, do you think that what we're seeing right now is either good leadership or the lack of strong leadership, especially in world sport? Because you took the lead in asking the IOC to postpone the Olympic Games simply because the athlete was not safe. The athlete was not being able to train without putting his or her life at risk.
Look, the decision around the Olympic Games, believe me, was a very complicated one, and I'm not attributing any blame at all to anybody, because I know, having been the president, the chair of the organising committee in London, I can only imagine how tough that would have been if somebody had said to me in March or April of 2012 that the Games were about to get cancelled or postponed. It would have been a very, very tough ask. You have to figure out what you do with your venues, your permanent ones, your temporary ones. You have your plethora of sponsorship arrangements. You have everything that you've done for 7 years. It's a long, long journey. And so we made a judgment that was predicated entirely on the conversations that I was having within the sport, particularly with the athletes, who were just effectively saying to me, look, you know, with the best will in the world, we understand why everybody's trying to keep our competitions alive and kicking, but it's just not, we're just not able to train. We're in lockdown. We can't leave our houses. You know, it's possible to keep in shape and do it pretty well with body conditioning exercises that you can frankly do in your own sitting room. But that's not the same as working on your stride patterns in a hurdles competition or throwing a javelin or a shot put. You need that specificity to get back into competition. And that's why we felt that if we didn't make our views very, very clear, then there was a risk that the athletes were going to be left in this emotional turmoil, this roller coaster, for longer than was humanly kind to them.
Of course, you know, Lord Coe, I've been speaking to a lot of India's Olympians and presumptive Olympians, those who were headed to their first Olympics, and anxiety is something which everyone seems to be suffering at the moment. Does this in any way compare to the anxiety you felt when in your career as a sports person, you had this uncertainty over the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which was sort of boycotted? Will we go? Will we not go? How do I keep my training going? Because at some point of time, Lord Coe, when people sit down and start looking again, this anxiety is bound to happen, because a lot of people may not be in their best shape 14 months from now. Some perhaps would have lost the opportunity to go out on a high, which they were perhaps planning in July, August of 2020.
Look, yes, it's a perfectly good question to ask, but I want to also make the point that we're no different from large swathes of the population globally that are anxious about their jobs, their children's educational opportunities. Some have lost exams, some are not, you know, jobs are disappearing. It's a very tough landscape. So sport is no different. But the athletes have one great attribute and skill, and that is that you don't get to the level that they've got to without being very resilient, very strong characters. And I think they will regroup quickly. I think that what I wanted to do was to give them some certainty and some clarity that at least took them away from that mental roller coaster that we talked about. But now they've got the opportunity to regroup. I'm hoping that some of them, by the day, are being able to get back onto public facilities, out of their training camps, and into the type of training that's going to allow them to compete. We're going to do everything we possibly can to get them back into competition. I think the majority of those athletes that have been performing well will still be there for Tokyo contention. For some, this is going to be tough because that extra year, particularly if they're towards the end of their career, is probably going to be a tough one. That there is always the risk, and it doesn't really matter how old you are in the sport, there's always the risk that you could get injured, and that might remove your success or the potential for success. So I think really what we need to do is to create the opportunity for competition, to give some certainty. It's not that we may not be able to get every event that we've identified at the latter part of this year up and running, but at least it's showing that we're going to do everything we possibly can to help them get there.
Okay, but the important question, Lord Coe, is will the games happen? Because Japan has already come out and said that perhaps if a vaccine isn't around, the possibility exists that the Olympic Games are not held. As it stands, that's a big if, because there's no vaccine at the moment.
Look, I'm not a scientist, and I don't think that I'm going to add any great or in-depth wisdom to this debate. What I would say is, I think speculating about something that is still over a year away is probably unhelpful. Look, there are, first of all, everybody whose judgment I value in this tells me that this is not an exact science. It is a new virus, and it can take untold and strange directions and journey in its life cycle. I think it's important that we create the structure and we give that opportunity for those athletes, if we possibly can, to compete. I don't want to speculate beyond the end of the year because, you know, I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful. And I don't think, given that we're trying to create some certainty or some clarity for the athletes, to have scientists speculating around something that we have to also make a decision about. It's not just simply about public health here. We have to make sure that the athletes, when they get back into competition, have got the opportunity to qualify properly, that we have our anti-doping processes back up and running. So sport needs to be very clear that actually some of these decisions should be with sport. They shouldn't just be sitting there with academic experts.
Okay, if you permit me, perhaps I could rephrase that a bit. You've been on that Olympic podium. You know what it is to compete at an Olympic Games. What would you prefer in the worst or a best case scenario? Having the Olympic Games go ahead because of the legacy and all that is there about which we celebrate about the Olympics behind closed doors, or perhaps not having the Olympics if they're not a celebration of the best sporting talent in the planet?
Look, I'm not avoiding a question. I just don't know how to answer that because it's purely speculative. Nobody would want an Olympic Games to go ahead without crowds. I really don't think anybody would want that. Beyond that, I hope we're not in a position where we even have to countenance that. I hope that we're in a position that the pandemic has been at least confined and contained. Whether or not we have a vaccine that is an appropriate one by then, I don't know. That's way above my pay grade. But I do think that at this very moment, speculating is not helpful to the athletes. I think we have a date. The International Olympic Committee and the international federations agreed on that date extremely quickly. It meant the added challenge for sports like World Athletics, moving its World Championships 1 year further down the line to be able to accommodate those changes. So I just hope that we don't get into, we don't get into what I would call the Monday night quarterback syndrome, where everybody is sort of guessing and pretending that these are easy decisions, and they're not. They're tough decisions. But at this moment, let's just work on trying to get athletes back into competition as quickly and as safely as we can. And the rest, I hope, will fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to challenge you on that, Lord Coe. But is it a huge challenge for administrators around the world to ensure that when sport resumes, the integrity of sporting competitions remain? You all have took a very brave decision right at the start that till the 1st of December, we're not going to accept anything in terms of results or world records, whatever happens. And that's going to be the big sort of challenge right now, because with lockdown and social distancing.
Yeah, the integrity of the competition has to be paramount. The reason that we felt that the games should be postponed was because we were fearful that if they went ahead, you would have some athletes that could be there and compete well because they weren't in a pandemic environment, and others who hadn't been able to leave their houses for 6 weeks at the point that we made a decision to postpone. So it's really important that when we do get back into competition, we get back where athletes are at least given as close to as you can possibly get in really difficult circumstances, level playing field. I don't want athletes that are still in lockdown sitting there watching other people in their disciplines and their events getting Olympic qualification when they can't even leave their sitting rooms. So we needed to give as lengthy a period as possible, not just to allow them to get back into competition, and that competition then beyond December would allow for Olympic qualification. We also wanted to be able to get our anti-doping processes in place, because we don't want that to be operating at a varied speed for some athletes that might be in tougher testing regimes than others. So there were lots of considerations that drove that. The athletes on our commission were, in the majority, strongly recommending a longer period of qualification suspension than some. And we are guided by what the athletes are telling us. It's important.
Okay, before I close, Lord Coe, since we are on the question of sporting integrity, this is the question I have to ask you, because you all have taken an extremely strong position on state-sponsored doping in Russia. Just before the lockdown happened, you all limited the cap on neutral athletes, hit them with a massive fine. But WADA has now come out and said there's still more cases emerging of manipulation of data. Do you think there's ever going to be a full-scale admission from Russian authorities of the scale of this state-sponsored doping?
Look, we set up an independent task force. The task force has done a very good job working with now the latest and the newest Russian Federation. The sanction was a serious one. It's there to stay. It's not negotiable. If Russia does want to rejoin the family of athletics nations, which I sincerely hope does happen, then they know exactly what they need to do. And because we're in lockdown and because there's no competition, that doesn't extend that period of sanction. They know exactly what they need to do, and they know exactly what dates they need to do it by. And the charges that were proven and accepted by the new Russian Federation were very serious, and I'm glad they've taken them seriously. And I await their next move, because it is important they meet the sanction that was extended, and my counsel are non-negotiable on that.
Okay. On that very strong note, Lord Coe, thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you. It's good to see you engage with us over here in India. I know you would want to be out on the grounds, perhaps watching your favorite Chelsea get back as soon as possible. But at the moment, we're all waiting as well. But hopefully, we see some great action. There's the Impossible Games coming up, which we all are waiting for. And hopefully, once the sporting season resumes, we all can sort of sit back and enjoy sport. That's something we've missed. I think we sort of took sport for granted, but right now we all going
Well,
to.
I've also missed cricket.
You of course miss cricket as well. Yes. Hopefully we see a World T20 as well this year.
It would be nice.